My parents were not into classical music. My dad loved jazz, loved Benny Goodman's band, and I grew up hearing jazz records at home, which I still love. And I was lucky enough to be taken to hear some of the great jazz pianists at the London House in Chicago, when some of them my father liked would be there, and we'd go there for dinner and hear great jazz pianists. And so that's always been part of it. But what really, listening to the radio as a young music student, and luckily in Chicago there was a great radio station, still there, WFMT, and I would hear all kinds of music. I'd listen as much as possible. And the first time I heard Mahler's First Symphony, in the third movement, there's this scene that sounds like a Yiddish band. So I want to hear more Mahler. So I was maybe 14 or something, and I went to the Chicago Public Library and got out another Mahler symphony recording. And then at the same time, hearing Mozart piano concertos. And I'm not a pianist. And at the same time, I just loved the Mozart piano concertos for their brilliance and melodic elegance, and how I find them very powerful in an elegant and delicate way. And hearing those has always had an impact on me. I'm someone who went to Hebrew school 4 days a week after going to public school, and then was at Shabbat services on Saturday morning most weeks, and then back to the synagogue on Sunday for Sunday school, which wasn't Hebrew school, but was more of Jewish history. So I was doing that for years, and I continued with Hebrew school after my bar mitzvah. As a high school student getting involved in classical music, I listened to lots of music, and I remember listening to Bach's B minor Mass when I was a high school sophomore, thinking, what a fantastic piece of music, and I learned more about it. And I was talking to a rabbi about a couple pieces like the B minor Mass and Beethoven's Christ on the Mount of Olives and things like that. And he was saying, you shouldn't be listening to things like that. And I said, but it's great music. And so we had this disagreement. And but I was always interested in Jewish music as well, and classical music together. As a college student at the University of Michigan, I was asked to conduct the choir for the Hillel Foundation for Friday night services. They were in a sort of Reformed tradition, Friday evening services. And I was not familiar with Reformed tradition. But one of my friends was the cantor. He was another music student. He was a graduate student in musicology. And I really got into conducting the choir and looking for music, and an interest in music other than the standard Louis Lewandowski and the Zulzer music that we used in synagogues at the time, and the Goldfarbs. I found a book at the university library of the 4-part harmony settings of the music from the Bevis Mark Synagogue in London, from the Spanish and Portuguese synagogue in London, as set in the late 19th century. And I took some of those and I said, let's try some of those with the choir. And we did that. And then I found a recording of, not from Bevis Marks, but from the Lauderdale Road Spanish and Portuguese Synagogue in London, an old Folkways recording, and listened to that. And I said, this is really interesting. So I just started branching out and using that music with my synagogue choir. At the same time, in about 1967 or so, a new edition of Solomone Rossi's synagogue music was being published in New York, and I convinced my parents for a Hanukkah gift to buy a subscription. It was going to be 3 volumes, one released one year, one released another year. It took forever to get those published, but when it was published, I was in New York. It was my first trip to New York, and I was there because of concerts for the 400th anniversary of Claudio Monteverdi's birth, and there were some great concerts that I wanted to attend. And I went to see the owner of the publishing company who was publishing the Rossi, who was an Orthodox Jew, said, if you don't tell anyone you have this, I'll give you a copy even with the wrong front piece because I know you want to use it right away. So I took my copy. I was thrilled that eventually in the next couple of years, volumes 2 and 3 were shipped to me. But I started using the Rossi music with the choir from Hillel and started doing some concerts of Rossi's music in 1967 or so, 66, 67. And that just sort of got me onto this idea of doing more and more with Jewish music. And I continued learning about it and getting interested and finding different traditions. I remember buying an old Westminster recording. It was called In Israel Today. There were 3 or 4 volumes of these LPs. And I heard a Moroccan enkelekenu with drums and qanun and all kinds of instruments. I thought, this is really fantastic. And I got to know people involved in Jewish music and a really wonderful cantor. And did that for a few years. Then some years later, that cantor had moved to a different synagogue and they needed a second choir director because they had 2 separate services for the high holidays, one in the main sanctuary, one in a huge social hall, and they alternated. And so they hired me to be one of the choir directors. And then through that, when that cantor left, Alberto Mizrahi came to that synagogue to be the cantor, and Abe and I became good friends. So it's the way things happen. You get interested in something, you get some expertise in it, and that leads you to people who are much greater experts than you are, and you grow with that experience. To me, it was very easy to pick up a shofar as a kid, and because I was playing the trumpet, and I said, I want to do that. So I started doing it when I was maybe 12 for the kids' services, and then started in high school doing it. And then when I was at Michigan for undergrad, we did the services for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur in Rackham Auditorium, and I would blow shofar there. And then I did it in the Army in Korea. I started doing more and more and more. And when I moved to Milwaukee, it just happened, the synagogue I was attending, the shofar, the Baltukea, had just left or retired or done something, and I didn't have to step on anyone's toes to do it. So I started doing that, and that really became an every year thing from the mid-90s until now. And during that time, I was lucky enough to be called by Neil Levin, who was the music director for the Milken Archive of American Jewish Music, to do the shofar solos in a piece by Hugo Weisgall called Tekiah Tot. And so I grabbed a bunch of shofarot and put them in a bag and flew to Seattle to work with Seattle Symphony and making the recording, and that got good reviews, and not too many people who do shofar in synagogues get to record with a major orchestra. So I was lucky to do that in the late 90s, but it's something that's been part of my Jewish experience for many, many years. And the way I approach it, I go through Tractate Rosh Hashanah in the Talmud every year for the sections on shofar, and even though I don't need to, but I reacquaint myself with all the rules of shofar. And I always had a feeling that the beracha of the Baltukea is really quite interesting, because it says, who commands us to hear the shofar, lishmoa kol shofar, to hear the voice of the shofar, not to blow the shofar. And I thought, okay, if you can create a technique where you're not worried about making the notes. You can actually concentrate on hearing it, not struggling to get the notes out. And so that's how I've always approached it. I felt that if I can get my technique on shofar strong enough that I don't have to worry about, is the next note going to come out, then I can concentrate on the listening, being outside of it. The playing is automatic, the listening is active. And that's how I've tried to approach it every year. One of the questions that always comes up is, what is Jewish music? And there's a great definition that I recall. I think it was by Kurt Sachs, the famous musicologist of the early 20th century, who defined Jewish music as music composed by a Jewish composer for a Jewish setting. So therefore, a piece like Leonard Bernstein's Chichester Psalms would be Jewish music because it's composed in Hebrew to a text of Psalms by a Jewish composer. But his West Side Story would not be Jewish music because it's not intended for a Jewish milieu for listening. So I've been thinking about that a lot and thinking about the Chichester Psalms. It was composed in 1965 to Hebrew texts of the Psalms. And it was written for the Chichester Cathedral in England, but it was premiered in New York at the Philharmonic in 1965. And that's an interesting time because I was a college freshman at the time, or maybe just after my freshman year. And it was exciting that there was a new piece by Bernstein ever since the Kaddish Symphony that he wrote following JFK's assassination. And this was much more upbeat, and it was so wonderful to hear Hebrew texts set in very modern and upbeat styles. So in the Chichester Psalms, the first psalm that he uses, he sets in 7/4 time. So it's like 1 2 1 2 1 2 3 1 2 1 2 1 2 3, and it's really always pushing forward. But then in the 23rd Psalm, he has a boy, so it's like David the shepherd boy, just a boy soprano with a very light orchestration featuring a lot of harp, and they say David played the harp. So this is a really wonderful, modern and exciting and upbeat setting of the Psalms. So as I was thinking about the Chichester Psalms, I was thinking, what other settings of psalm texts do I really, really love? And that's from 35 years earlier, 1930, Bernstein's mentor, Serge Koussevitzky, who was music director of the Boston Symphony, commissioned Igor Stravinsky to write the Symphony of Psalms for the Boston Symphony's 50th anniversary. And Stravinsky wrote them in Latin. Stravinsky was a Russian Orthodox Christian, but he wrote them in Latin. And it's such an amazing, amazing piece. It's exciting. It's got great choral writing, great orchestral writing, and the setting of the 150th Psalm is fantastic. It's part of the Symphony of Psalms by Stravinsky. A non-Jewish composer for a non-Jewish setting using Jewish texts but in the Latin translations. The usual tune you hear for Shalom Aleichem on Friday evenings before dinner is not a traditional tune. It was written by the Goldfarb brothers in around 1919 or so, sitting outdoors by the Columbia University Library, and was published in their book, The Jewish Songster, in 1925. It caught on like wildfire, and everyone thinks it's some sort of a traditional Hasidic tune. In fact, once I bought a recording it was called Hasidic Tunes, and it was that Shalom Aleichem was on there, but it's not. It was written in the 20th century. And there's so much changing and taking things that when you hear some of the original Sulzer or Lewandowski music in context, in the four-part choir with the cantor, it's very beautifully written. But what's happened is that it's become a congregational tune, and it's been changed, and the texts are not in the same place against the notes where they were written. And so they've sort of passed into traditional usage rather than written music usage. Other composers, especially those composers from Central Europe and Eastern Europe who were Jewish, would often use traditional Jewish modes in their music. So, for example, in Mahler's First Symphony, Mahler grew up in Bohemia. His father owned a tavern. There was a military base nearby. He heard the bands playing. And in the First Symphony, there's a little scene where it sounds like a little group of klezmorim walking across with a bass drum and a cymbal. And what sounds Jewish about it is that there's an augmented second. I mean, there's the Jewish Ahava Rabbah mode. It's the kind of thing that a Broadway composer would write to make it sound Jewish. So you hear that kind of a mode in lots of music that's in things like Fiddler on the Roof or any kind of things trying to sound Jewish. But that kind of music was also played by the Rom people in Hungary, and it all kind of mixed up. But a lot of Central European composers would use those kinds of modes in their music, and it sort of would sound Jewish. And other Jewish composers, you would never hear any of that because they were classical composers who happened to be Jewish. You listen to music by, I was just reading some of the music criticisms that Victor Ullmann wrote before he was taken to Theresienstadt and then to Auschwitz, when he was a music critic in Prague. And Ullmann was also a composer, and none of his music sounds Jewish. It was 20th century classical music by a Jewish composer. But sometimes you hear it, sometimes you don't. Sometimes the composers deliberately put Jewish sounding intervals into pieces, and other times they didn't. And there's just a wide range of what is Jewish music. Even, for example, the music by Bloch in the Sacred Service or by Darius Milhaud in his Shabbat service doesn't sound particularly like it comes from a cantorial tradition. It's music. I mean, Kurt Weill's Kiddush, the Friday Night Kiddush by Kurt Weill, that he wrote shortly before he died, is filled with blues chords. And I remember when the first time I conducted that for the University Hillel, and we did it because we did the Kiddush at the service, people said, "What is that?" And it's because it's all bluesy. It's great. It's a gorgeous piece, but it doesn't sound Jewish other than the fact that it has the Friday Night Kiddush text in Hebrew. So it's and I think the Salomone Rossi music has no connection to Jewish chant or anything like that, but it's beautiful music. So I think that it's sometimes hard to pin down what is Jewish about a composition. That's difficult. I think just listen. And again, I think it's the context. Was it meant to be performed in a Jewish context? Was it meant to be? Was there a Jewish-based theme or inspiration for creating the piece? And if not, it's a piece of music by a Jewish composer, not a piece of Jewish music by a Jewish composer. At least that's how I look at it. I got a call from a dear friend who had been the director of the Grant Park Summer Festival in Chicago, the symphonic concerts, which were free and open to the public, that I went to as a high school kid. I'd get on the bus and go down there. He was leaving and going to work with another orchestra and said, "You should apply for this." And I won the job and spent 12 wonderful years presenting 40 free concerts every summer in downtown Chicago. But what was really wonderful was that it was a festival that had been so important to me as a student, and coming back 15 years later as the director, and providing that kind of great music with a great orchestra to the public was, I think, a really important part of my life. I was also lucky enough to be a participant in the first Chicago Gospel Festival, the Chicago Jazz Festival, the Blues Festival. I got to meet Thomas A. Dorsey, the great gospel pianist and composer, and I had known of Tom Dorsey's music from his work with Ma Rainey, the blues singer. So I made the terrible mistake. I walked up to him, meeting him for the first time. I said, "Mr. Dorsey, it's such a great pleasure to meet you. I've loved your work, especially the work you did with Ma Rainey." And he said, "Stephen, that was a different person. I now only do music for the Lord." And he said, "And I don't want to hear about that anymore, that old music." But I got to meet the father of modern gospel music and work with him for a couple of years. And it was such an honor. And but at a certain point, it was time to move indoors. And I was offered the job as vice president and general manager of the Minnesota Orchestra in Minneapolis. And we moved to Minneapolis, spent nearly 5 years there. And then I was offered the president CEO job of the Milwaukee Symphony, and moved to Milwaukee in the mid-90s. When I left Milwaukee, after about 8 or 9 years there, and was approached by a national arts search firm, and he said, "Would you take something as small as a festival?" I said, "Depending on what it is." And he said, "Santa Fe Chamber Music Festival." Well, I said, "Well, I mean, that's really high level." And next thing I knew, I got a call from Pinchas Zuckerman, who I had hired as principal guest conductor of the Milwaukee Symphony, and I'd worked with Pinchas for many years. And at that time, Pinchas was coming out and playing at the festival here every summer, because he and Mark Nykrug, the festival's artistic director, were a recital duo, Mark playing piano and Pinchas violin. So I got a call from Pinchas. He said, "You should do this, you'll love it." Then I got a call from Mark. Mark said, "Really think about this, I think you'd have a great time here." And I came out here in January of '04, and then came back 2 weeks later, and a couple of weeks later they hired me, and I started in March of '04. So I had 20 seasons, beginning with the '04 season and ending with the 2023 season. Everything that this festival does here in Santa Fe is fantastic. And I'm just delighted to have been associated with them for 20 years. Every classical musician I know is always asked, "Who's your favorite composer?" or "What's your favorite piece?" So I would say that of the composers that I seek out to listen to when I have time to enjoy music, I would say Heinrich Schütz, the 17th century German composer, Claudio Monteverdi, the Italian 17th century composer, both of whom were, Schütz went to Venice and studied with Gabrieli. So it's Schütz and Monteverdi to me are part of the same sound world, but I love both of them, both their Latin and German, and Schütz's Latin and German compositions. Mozart, which I can listen to any time, whether it's a Mozart opera or piano concerto or symphony. And then from Mozart, there's a lot of romantic composers I love, Beethoven, Berlioz, etc., Schumann, but I would jump from there to Mahler. And again, I was so influenced by the early New York Philharmonic Bernstein recordings from the early 60s. Those were fantastic performances, and I've expanded from there and love Mahler symphonies. If I have an hour and a half to listen, or an hour to listen to something, and I'm always interested in the newest, latest recordings of certain things. Like just yesterday, I listened to a brand new recording that I find fantastic of Monteverdi's 1610 Vespers. And also, I'm looking forward to listening to a new recording of Mahler's Second Symphony. So those are things that I enjoy. And I also love Stravinsky and Bartók very much. There's always something of Stravinsky that you can find that fits a mood for listening right now. But those are the main composers that I'll go to. But oftentimes I'm listening to 1920s old jazz recordings, or 1930s big bands, or 40s big bands. And my interest in music is a lot broader than classical. I love lots of traditional musics from around the world. I love very much different types of regional Mexican music, whether it's mariachi music from Jalisco or Huastecas from the east coast of Mexico. I love Mexican regional music very much. I love Balkan music. I love Greek music, Greek traditional music, both the really rural music and the laika, the popular Greek music of the 60s, 50s and 60s, composers like Zarchachos and Theodorakis and things like that. I love that music. I do listen to a lot of Renaissance and Baroque music, and I love the psalm settings of Heinrich Schütz, the Dresden-based composer who lived a century before Bach, brought all of the wonderful color of the Gabrielis and Monteverdi back to Dresden with him and wrote the most incredible psalm settings. Schütz's setting of Psalm 136, in Hebrew, Hodu Lashem Ki Tov, and the repeated refrain, Kile Lam Chasto, in Hebrew, which he sets in German to the Martin Luther German translations of the Psalms. Unbelievable piece of music. It just keeps going and going. It's so powerful and it's colorful. And this from 1619. Just, again, music based on Jewish themes, but in a non-Jewish setting. But we should all know this piece because it's just such an exciting setting of Psalm 136. And other psalm settings that I love, Salomone Rossi, the Jewish composer from Mantua who lived in Venice, a friend of Monteverdi, a great viola da gamba player, a composer for the Duke of Mantua. His setting of Psalm 121, Esa Enai, I lift my eyes to the mountains, is absolutely stunningly beautiful. A four-part unaccompanied chorus. And that's one in Hebrew for a Jewish setting by a Jewish composer, but in the style of the late Monteverdi madrigals. Absolutely beautiful, beautiful music that I think as Jews who are interested in music and in our own liturgy, we should become familiar with those settings. So those are things I think that we should all hear, these psalm settings. The Psalm 122 in English, I was glad when they said unto me, which we say every Shabbat morning in Shacharit also. The setting by Sir Hubert Parry for the coronation of King Edward VII. Fantastic piece. It's used at every British coronation ever since. Just gorgeous English setting of a Hebrew psalm, and it's become a standing piece at every coronation since. Other Jewish music that has really affected me over the years, there are certain songs, Yiddish popular songs, to the point some people think of them as folk songs, but they're not. They're from Yiddish theater. Songs like Eufen Prepitschik and things that are very well known, to the point that on most albums where someone recorded them, it said more Jewish folk songs, and this was not a folk song. It was written for a theater production. There's other songs like that. The songs of Mordechai Gebertag are beautiful. He lived during the Holocaust in Poland, wrote some very, very beautiful Yiddish songs. Those are wonderful. The songs of the Balkan Sephardim, so much time when we talk about Sephardic music, people say, oh, that those tunes go back to Spain in the 15th century. They don't. They're more like 19th century Balkan tunes or 18th century Balkan tunes with texts that came from Spain, the romanceros, but the tunes are much more Balkan and Greek and Saloniki, and I love those songs. And the popular Sephardic music from Turkey and Greece in the early 20th century, where the same song would be recorded with Judeo-Spanish texts and then in Greek. Because it was the same song, they would translate the text, and those are exciting. People who performed them, and they were part of popular culture, just the same way that in Eastern Europe, so many recordings of Yiddish instrumental music, what everyone now calls klezmer, were recorded in the early 20th century, and you can get a really great sense into the real style of those Eastern European performers. Belf's Romanian Orchestra, for example, and others that made early recordings. 1907, I have one going back to 1907, 1908, where you can really hear the style of the time, and it wasn't, the tempo wasn't pushed and jazzed up the way a lot of modern Yiddish bands do it. A lot of that happened after so many Eastern European musicians came to the United States and were affected by early jazz. And so they picked that up, and just like every bit of Jewish musical culture, it's always got a piece of the local style in it. After 1915, 1920, a lot of the Yiddish musicians sounded like they were Dixieland jazz bands, but with Yiddish tunes. And even the nature of the band changed. They would have, instead of violin, flute, clarinet, they went to clarinet, trumpet, trombone, piano, banjo. That's the front line of a Dixieland band. And that's what they started doing, bringing more brass and wind instruments into it. Although there were always military band sounds in Yiddish music. Jewish musicians who served in the Tsar's army bands who came out, and then they had that sound in their mind. All these influences are part of our music, and I love the different influences. I love hearing the music of the British Sephardi synagogues that has a lot of very Victorian sounding harmonies in it, and that's as wonderful as hearing music done the way the original music of Sulzer in Vienna or Lewandowski in Berlin, and making it fit for the then new Reform synagogues, the progressive synagogues of the time, adding an organ, adding 4-part mixed choruses, and not just male voices unaccompanied. In the late 20s, the Berlin Reform community made records of the music for the Reform services that they would then send out to congregations in smaller towns, and they would play those recordings during the Friday night services. And there's a Kedusha for the Shabbat morning Shacharit service by Lewandowski, and it's all in German except for the words Kadosh, 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 and the Shema Yisrael, and those are in Hebrew, but everything else is in German, but a direct translation of the Hebrew text. And it's wonderful to hear what that sounded like. And luckily those recordings were preserved through the war, and they were reissued 25 years ago, the entire set of the recordings for the German Reform movement in the 20s. And it's great to hear these. They sound very Lutheran churchy, but that was the point. That was what they were trying to accomplish. In mentioning these late 1920s Berlin recordings for the German Reform community, it's only a few years later, when the Nazis came in, they banned all Jewish musicians from performing in their orchestras. Members of the Berlin Philharmonic were kicked out. Jewish musicians who were teaching in conservatories were kicked out. And the Nazis forced them to create the Kulturbund. And they were allowed to perform, but only for other Jews. And they were allowed to make some recordings, but only to be sold to other Jews. No non-Jewish German was allowed to attend, and no Jews were allowed to perform for non-Jewish Germans. And what that did was brought certain Jewish musicians, cantors, were able to come in and make some recordings that were then distributed to other German Jews. But a number of the Jewish musicians in Germany who were not Yiddish speaking, they spoke German. The Ostjuden, the Polish and Russian Jews spoke Yiddish, but not most of the German Jews. But a lot of them started recording Yiddish songs. They started looking at other parts of Jewish music to record for themselves, and some of them wound up getting exported to the German communities that were being begun in Israel. And so the forcibly compressed community that had to perform only for itself did look at lots of different kinds of Jewish music and arranged some Jewish dances that really weren't part of German Jewish culture, but were more Eastern, and arranged them for orchestra, and the Kulturbund orchestras would record them and distribute them. And it was a horrible way to access Jewish culture because of the oppressiveness of it. And of course that went away once it got close to the war starting. That was all dissolved, and those Jews were sent to camps. In the world of classical music, we think of so many Jewish performers, conductors, composers, managers, and yet it wasn't until the mid-19th century when the, quote, liberation of Jews in Germany happened that Jews were allowed into conservatories. And Louis Lewandowski, who wrote for the Berlin Reform community, was one of the first Jews allowed into the Berlin Conservatory. And once they were allowed, it opened a floodgate of Jewish performers and composers learning and becoming professionals in Europe. And in Odessa, in Ukraine, great Jewish violinists came out of there because of Leopold Auer, who taught there. And so people like Heifetz and others from the early 20th century, mid-20th century, who came out of this Odessa school of violin playing. The piece, I think, that really brought Jewish music into the chamber music repertoire is the Dreams and Prayers of Isaac the Blind by the Argentinian Jewish composer Osvaldo Golijov. And that piece uses a couple of well-known Ashkenazi tunes in the piece. The Odessa Bulgar is a dance tune that's used in one movement, and a small snippet of the High Holiday traditional Avinu Malkeinu is also used in the Dreams and Prayers of Isaac the Blind. It's for clarinet and string quartet, and it is a wonderful virtuoso piece that I think we all should listen to again or listen to for the first time, by a major composer who has, in many of his works, brought his Jewish heritage into his contemporary music stylings. I think that that is one piece that really helped bring Jewish music into the forefront in chamber music, sort of the same way that decades earlier, Prokofiev's overture on Hebrew themes, or overture on Jewish themes, depending on how you translate the Russian, which is clarinet, piano, and string quartet. And that's also a wonderful piece, not really based on an accent Jewish tune, but Jewish sounding, Russian, Yiddish sounding tune. And again, a very worthwhile piece to listen to. But those two, those are a place to start. My friend Roberto Sierra, from a great composer from Puerto Rico originally, now teaching at Cornell, has taken a number of the Sephardic tunes from the Balkan region, the songs of the diaspora for soprano and instruments based on Sephardic tunes, is really sort of for me, the touchstone of Sephardi music and chamber music. Now that I've mentioned a piece based on Sephardic tunes and a piece based on Ashkenazi tunes, what are the differences or similarities? The Sephardic music, because it's from the Balkan region in general, is based on Turkish makam, the Turkish musical modes, cantorial music from Istanbul around 1910. It is totally Turkish. I mean, you hear very little what you would think of as being Jewish. And the Western Arabic music, which is also Andalus music, developed in its own way, and there's a whole Moroccan classical tradition of vocal and instrumental music, which then transferred into the Jewish Moroccan tradition. And my favorite is watching, having had the privilege of having dinner with Chaim Luke many years ago, who could get up and sing Moroccan music in Arabic and then lead a service, because he was a rabbi, chazan, and a writer of piyutim, and was totally comfortable in the Arabic Moroccan tradition as well as the Jewish Moroccan tradition. We could take this entire worldview of music and focus it in only on Jewish music and still have incredible differences of style and of sound, and it's all still Jewish music.